In today's presentation, we are covering bare root and root ball tree planting. Now, this might not necessarily be something that we do every day, particularly in sports turf, but in terms of horticulture and landscaping, this is something that crops up every now and again. Within sports turf, this will usually be in the winter months when we'd be planting up tree copses on golf courses, around newly built areas for planning permissions, and so on and so forth. So it is something that we have to be aware of, and it is something that can easily be done wrong. So ensuring that we're doing it in the correct way, following these practices, will ensure that the trees hopefully take and survive as long as possible. The four main benefits of trees: erosion control. Trees help stabilize soil and prevent erosion. So if you're planting on banks, water edges, those sort of things, this will help maintain to ensure that the bank, for example, doesn't slip or fall away from the surface of the slope. And this is because the roots of the tree will be then rooted in and bedded down. You'll probably often notice that areas that have been weed sprayed or weed killed tend to have landslides or miniature landslides on them, whereas areas which have vegetation, trees, shrubs, foliage on them tend to not slide as much because of the root profile, with the root growth within that profile. Aesthetics: well-placed trees enhance the visual appeal of our open spaces, of our parks, of our training facilities, of our golf courses. They can also help improve the game. For example, in golf, you can strategically plant or remove trees in certain places to have, a harder or an easier shot on a particular hole. Shade and windbreak, really important for, outdoor large facilities. There might not be somewhere that you'd be able to go and shade, especially for sort of medical emergencies. And even in warmer climates, having those trees around will help cool areas. Bit of a pain in some certain areas, leaves falling onto the sports pitches, onto golf greens, onto tennis courts. But having them there will be more beneficial than not having them there, unless it is within a really close proximity of your sports turf surface. Wildlife and habitat, obviously, we're going to get all sorts of birds nested in there, lots of biodiversity. Even when the tree rots and dies, there's going to be insects within the tree, insects eating the organic material that's rotting away, broadening that biodiversity and creating more habitats. Types of trees: there's three things we want to be thinking about. Do we want to be selecting native species, choosing trees that are well adapted to a local environment and are going to have a much better chance of survival? Low maintenance varieties, so this is opting for trees with minimal care, minimal requirements, suitable to be around an area which is, I don't know, it's going to be a hotel. You don't want to be able to cushion it every year, for example. But also, you don't want it to grow too large, you don't want it too big, you don't want it overhanging windows. Same on a golf green here. We don't want the pine trees overhanging the golf green. We know they're only going to get so wide, so you can plant them a certain distance away and sort of roughly know that you're going to be in the good sort of area without being covered in shade for a number of years. Climate and soil considerations. So each site is completely different. If you've got a really windy site, you don't want to be planting silver birches that are going to have more chance of tipping over. Because of the shallow rooted nature of the trees, you might want to be planting trees which root slightly deeper, and then consider what else is around. Consider the other trees. You won't be planting silver birch in the middle of a pine forest because it's probably not going to survive. It's going to be really dry within a pine forest, for example. And then the soil, so the pH, the nutrient levels. What type of soil is it rocky, is it stony, is it slaty soil, is it loamy, is it clay? Will that tree actually survive through all four of the seasons? Planning for tree planting, really important. Whether this is actually for planning or you actually, you're working out where you want to put trees, just on any particular site. I mentioned earlier about the golf course, making changes to the play by adding trees, but also around sports fields. You don't want to be, surrounding an artificial pitch with Trees, knowing that the leaves are going to fall off, and you're going to have to be cleaning them up every year. So you sort of be mindful about where you're putting the trees and take into consideration the potential impacts down the line. Are you going to be creating more maintenance programs, more maintenance processes, as opposed to putting it in a different location where it might actually be better suited? So assess sun exposure, shade patterns, understand those soil types, drainage patterns on your site. Obviously you'll know them better than anyone else. And then infrastructure considerations. So is there any existing drainage, any irrigation systems that are already in place to water those trees as well? And then ensure that the tree placement won't interfere with any sort of sports activities. So, you won't be going and planting in the middle of a football field. This has happened before up in Scotland, in Aberdeenshire, where the local council planted on a sports field. There was some miscommunication. But you wouldn't be doing that in a typical scenario. Obviously, we want to be looking out for other things as well, services, gas, water, electricity. We want to be trying to avoid those sort of things. So we're not rooting around them. Same with the drainage, causing us potential issues in the future. So the two main types of planting, bare root tree planting and root balls. So bare root is literally as it is, the tree roots are sold exposed, so they'll just be in a bin liner just to keep some moisture on them. It's cost effective, lightweight, easier to handle, but the issue is there's a limited time window for planting those trees, typically in the colder, wetter months. So the sort of November to sort of February months. There's risk of foot damage during there's also risk of damage to the roots during transport, but it's not too bad. You'll typically have a sort of 80-90% strike rate on bare root trees, even ones that have been neglected a little bit and haven't had quite as much water as they needed over the summer months after planting, for example. Whereas a root ball, you'll have a much more chance of survival because you've got a lot of soil and structure around that root profile already. It's quite well established. So root ball trees are sold with that soil and roots encased in the ball, as I just mentioned. There's much wider planting window. You can plant over the summer as well if it's been root balled at the right time, and it's been kept moist and it's still growing. There is a bit of a risk of damage to the roots, when it's dug up, but because you're creating, typically, a 30 centimeter plus size circle around the tree itself, you're going to actually take a lot of that root profile with you, reducing any sort of damage on the roots. Those disadvantages are they are much heavier and typically expensive because of the process and the transportation costs with moving all of that soil. You think a bare rooted tree, you can get 10, 20 in a bin bag. Depending on the size, obviously the top might be poking out of the bin bag. But then in terms of a root ball tree, you'd only get one tree in the same sort of size area. So you can see the sort of differences there. You can root ball and bare root most trees, anything pines, fruit trees, all the native species, all the oaks, even down to shrubs, laurels. Those can be either or, root ball, bare rooted. There's lots of different options for both of these. So here we can see some bare root tree planting. On the right, you can see a bare root tree. You can see most of the soil is typically removed on the bare rooted tree. And then on the left, this is normally what a bare rooted tree planting area looks like, because all you need to do is go along, as we'll suggest in a second, put a hole in the ground, put your tree in and heel it in, basically. So it's much more efficient to actually plant them. So you normally you see them in bigger areas. Covering larger areas, sorry. And then in terms of root ball trees, you usually see only 10 or so at a time together. They tend to be more bigger, more developed trees, so they're going to be more further apart. Whereas the bare rooted trees will be a mixture of shrubs and trees as well. So you have some of the lower growth, some of the higher growth. You're trying to create woodlands essentially. Whereas potentially root ball trees, you might just be trying to extend woodlands, just create some shaded areas and that sort of a thing. So preparing for tree planting, what can we be doing? Site preparation, clearing debris, weeds to create a clean planting area. We can test that soil, as I mentioned earlier, to ensure that it's the correct tree for the correct site. We don't want it dying because of an imbalanced soil. pH, for example, when we could have tested that and avoided that whole thing if necessary. Equipment, we can use shovels, spades, stakes, tree ties, and our normal watering equipment, so watering cans. Some will have the tubes placed in when planted in the root balls to ensure that the water goes directly down into the root profile. Steps for bare root tree planting. So we want to select good quality bare root trees. That's going to give us the best chance for survival. We want to inspect the roots for any damage, any diseases, any rot. Soak them in water if we can before planting. This just helps them take a little bit better. When we're digging the hole, we want to dig the hole twice the width of the root spread and deep enough for the roots. This is not always the case. If you've got little shallow rooted trees, as on the top right with the pine, you can actually just put a spade slit into the ground and heel it back together. So you don't technically always need to dig a hole, but it is advised, especially with bigger bare rooted trees. Placing and positioning the trees, so spread those roots evenly in the planting hole and then adjust the tree depth to match the previous soil line. So that's the line on the crown or the base of the tree. So you can see where the trunk starts and the root sort of structure begins. You just want the first few roots on the crown of the plant to be above the surface. You don't want it to be too low because you don't want to rot the tree. You don't want it to be too high because you don't want the roots sitting above the surface as well. Backfilling and watering, we want to fill the hole with soil. We want to ensure that there's no air pockets. Then we want to ensure that we water the plant thoroughly to settle the soil. Root ball and tree planting steps. So again, we're doing the same things. We're choosing the right quality trees, So while we're digging a hole, we want to dig a hole that is slightly bigger than the root ball because we can always fill back in. We want to ensure that any soil underneath the root ball is nice and fluffy, it's not compact. This will help the roots, once they break out of the root ball, bed into the soil around. Whereas if it was really hard, it would be difficult for the roots to get outside of that root ball, and then they become root bound or pot bound, as they say. And then basically the tree will only root within its structure that already is around it, or what is easy. It won't go further beyond that, especially if water and nutrients are already being put into the profile within that area. Placing and positioning the tree, exactly the same as bare roots. We want to put the tree into the hole, ensuring that it's centered, and then position the top of the root ball level with the ground. Backfilling and watering is a very similar process as well. We want to fill the hole with the soil and then water and then eliminate any sort of major air pockets within the soil, just so that there's no dips or drops within the soil once it settles. Staking and support, really important. This is to provide support against wind and prevent the tree from leaning. A leaning tree might lead on to other issues in the future. You can see trees obviously get planted quite a lot in car parks. We don't want those trees falling over once they become mature because they've got too heavy with the leaves on one side, for example. Correct staking is really important. Use of flexible tree ties to avoid damage, and stake loosely to allow for some natural movement. There is going to be some wind. Trees do naturally move in the wind, so we don't want to be literally nailing it to a plank so it doesn't move at all. A tree is designed to withstand a certain amount of wind movement. Post-plant care, we can do things such as mulching, which is applying a layer of mulch on the base. This is basically for moisture retention and weed control, but also will help bring nutrients into the soil over a number of years once it starts to break down. However, when it's first put on, it will take the nitrogen out of the soil, so you might need to fertilize. This is because of the mulch breaking down, but after a couple of years or a year or so, it will start to break down and put those nutrients back into the soil. Watering schedule, we want to establish a regular watering schedule, especially during those dry periods over the summer months. We want to have a good schedule on monitoring the tree health. So this is checking for signs of stress, pests, diseases, and damage, and that any issues are promptly addressed to ensure tree survival.